Hello dear children, welcome back. I'm Dr. Jisha Joe. In this session, we shall start with a new chapter, the nervous system. We all know that one of the important characteristics of any living organism is to be aware of its environment. A living organism should be aware of its surroundings and should be able to act accordingly for its proper survival. These actions performed by a living organism may be internal or external. And all these actions should be done at the proper time in a coordinated manner. The coordination of these actions is brought about by two systems in our body. We have already discussed about the first system, the endocrine system, and the second system is the nervous system, which we are going to start today. Why should we have a nervous system? What is the need of nervous system in our body? The first need is that nervous system keeps us informed about what is happening around us. Nervous system keeps us informed about the surroundings. The second function or second need for the nervous system is that it helps us to think, remember, reason out, etc. It is because of the nervous system we are able to think, remember things, reason out, etc. The third need for nervous system is that nervous system helps in the harmonization of the voluntary activities of our body. Voluntary activities refers to the activities which are under our control. So it is because of the nervous system the regulation and the coordination of voluntary activities are taking place in our body. And the fourth need is that it coordinates or it regulates the involuntary activities of the body. Involuntary activities refer to the activities which are not under control, like for example the heartbeat. So it is because of the nervous system the regulation of the involuntary activities are taking place in our body. So there are four points to remember. Why should we have a nervous system? The first need of the nervous system is that it keeps us informed about the surroundings. Second function, it helps us to think, remember, reason out, etc. Third point is that it regulates and harmonizes or coordinates the voluntary activities of our body. And the fourth need is that it regulates all the involuntary activities of our body. Our nervous system consists of the brain, the spinal cord, the sense receptors, and a large number of nerves. So we can say that the basic structural and functional unit of the nervous system is the neuron or the nerve cells. The brain and the spinal cord are made up of the nerve cells or the neurons, which form the basic structural and functional unit of the nervous system. Okay, so our nervous system consists of the brain, the spinal cord, sense receptors, and a large number of nerves. And the brain and the spinal cord are made up of nerve cells or neurons. The neurons form the basic structural and functional unit of the nervous system. Now we shall move on to the structure of a neuron. We have seen that neuron is the basic structural and functional unit of the nervous system. Now we are going to study the structure of a neuron. A neuron consists of three parts. There are three parts for a neuron. The first part is the cell body. The cell body, which is otherwise called as the cyton, or it is also called as the perikaryon. Perikaryon. The second is the dendron and the dendrites. And the third region is the axon. So these are the three parts of a neuron. They are the cell body, dendrites, and the axon. Now I shall draw the structure of a neuron. Okay, that is a neuron. That is the cell body. The cell body has the cytoplasm. Okay, that is the cytoplasm. In the cytoplasm is present the nucleus, and all the cell organelles are present except the centrosome. Centrosome is absent in nerve cell. We know centrosomes are needed for the formation of spindle fibers during cell division, and centrosomes are present in animal cells. But nerve cells do not have centrosomes. That means they have lost their capacity to divide. Nerve cells or neurons are not able to divide because of the absence of centrosomes. So there is a nucleus, that is the cytoplasm. All the cell organelles are present except the centrosome. Centrosome is absent. Centrosome absent. Okay, that is important. Centrosomes are absent in nerve cells or neurons. That means they have lost their capability or capacity to divide. Then there are granules, fine granules present in the cytoplasm. These granules are called as the Nissel's granules. Nissel's granules are present in the cytoplasm. So that is the cell body. Okay, so I hope you have understood the cell body. Okay, cell body or the cytone. So the cell body or the cytone has a well-defined nucleus. It is surrounded by cytoplasm. The cytoplasm contains all the cell organelles except the centrosome, and fine granules are present in the cytoplasm. These granules are called as the Nissel's granules. Now moving on to the second part, dendrites. Okay, dendrites is the second region. Dendrites are a small cytoplasmic projections from the cytone or the cell body. So you can see projections there. These projections are called as the dendron. Dendron, which branch or which divides further to form finer branches, which are called as the dendrites. Okay, so that is the dendron, which form finer cytoplasmic projections called dendrites. Okay, so that is the second part, the dendrites. They are fine cytoplasmic projections from the cell body. And it is these dendrons that conduct the nerve impulses into the cytone. So the impulse is received by the dendrites. From one neuron, the impulse, the nerve impulse from one neuron is received by the dendrites of the adjacent neuron. So it is through the dendrites, then through the dendron, the impulse reaches the cytone or the cell body. Now the third region is the axon. You can see the long extension there from the cell body. That is a long process arising from the cell body, which is called as the axon. And the axon of most neurons have a sheath surrounding them. A white insulating sheath is present surrounding the axon of a neuron. This sheath is called as the myelin sheath. Myelin sheath. Okay, so we know we can see that as the nerve impulses pass through the axon of the neurons, there is a chance for the mixing up of impulses of the adjacent neurons. So this mixing up of impulses of the adjacent neurons is prevented with the help of the white insulating sheath which is called as the myelin sheath. So surrounding the axon, that long process there, you can see that is the axon. Surrounding the axon is the white insulating sheath which is called as the myelin sheath, or it is also called as the medullary sheath. Then outside the myelin sheath, is the neurilemma. Okay, that is a layer which is seen surrounding the myelin sheath. Myelin sheath is surrounded by a thin layer or a thin sheath which is called as the neurilemma. And if you look closely at the axon, you can see there are certain regions where myelin deposition is not there. Can you see these regions where myelin is not deposited? These regions are called as the nodes of Ranvier. Node of Ranvier. Okay, where myelin sheath deposition is absent. Such regions are called as the nodes of Ranvier. Okay, so that is the third region, axon. Axon is a long process arising from the cyton or the cell body, and the axon is surrounded by a white insulating sheath which is called as the myelin sheath, which in turn is covered by an outermost thin sheath which is called as the neurilemma. And you can see the myelin sheath is not continuous but shows gaps in between. Can see there are certain regions where myelin deposition does not take place, and such regions are called as the nodes of Ranvier. Okay, and at the end of the axon, that is the axon endings, that is the axon endings. You can see terminal knobs at the axon endings. Okay, axon terminals. These are the axon terminals. Or axon endings, and you can see small knob like structures or bulb like structures present at the axon endings, which can store certain chemical substances called neurotransmitters, which help in the transmission of impulses from one neuron to the adjacent neuron. So you can see the axon terminals having the bulbs there or knob like structures which store the chemical substances called as the neurotransmitters. And the neurotransmitter present is acetylcholine. And I told you what is the function. It is necessary for the transmission of impulses from the axon endings of one neuron to the dendrites of the adjacent neuron. We have already seen that a neuron receives a nerve impulse at the dendrites. And from the dendrites, it passes through the dendron, then it reaches the cyton, then passes through the axon till the axon terminals. And by the time the impulse reaches the axon terminals, chemical substances which are called as neurotransmitters will be released there, and the impulse will be passed on from the axon terminal or axon ending to the dendrites of the adjacent neuron. So that is how the nerve impulse passes. Okay, from here it passes to the next neuron. So the nerve impulse is received at the dendrites and it passes out through the axon terminals or the axon endings. So that is the structure of a neuron, which is the basic structural and functional unit of the nervous system. Consists of three parts: the cell bodies or cyton or perikaryon. You should be familiar with these two terms also. The second region is the dendrites, and the third part of the neuron is the axon. Okay, cell body, that is the cell body which has a well-defined nucleus at the center. It has a cytoplasm surrounding the nucleus, and it has all the cell organelles except the centrosome. That is why we say that the nerve cells have lost their capacity to divide. Why? Because it lacks the centrosome. Centrosomes are absent in neurons or nerve cells. The second part is the dendrites. Dendrites or the dendrons are the fine cytoplasmic projections arising from the cell body. That is the dendron. Dendron gives rise to finer projections which are called as the dendrites. And the third part of the neuron is the long process that you see there, that is the axon. And the axon has a white insulating sheath surrounding it, which is called as the myelin sheath. The myelin sheath is not continuous but leaves gaps in between, and these regions are called as the nodes of Ranvier. And surrounding the myelin sheath, there is a thin outer sheath which is called as the neurilemma. And the function of the myelin sheath is to prevent the mixing up of impulses passing through the adjacent axons or the adjacent neurons. Okay, so I hope that is clear to you. Now at the end of the axon has the axon terminals, and at the axon terminals you can see the knob or the bulb-like structure, which are structures or bulbs which store chemical substances called neurotransmitters, and the neurotransmitter present is acetylcholine. The function of the neurotransmitter is to help the impulse to pass from one neuron to the adjacent neuron. Close to the axon terminals of this neuron, this is one neuron, these are the axon terminals of this neuron. Close to the axon terminals of this neuron, you can see the dendrites of the adjacent neuron. But you can see that the axon endings or the axon terminals of one neuron and the dendrites of the adjacent neuron are not in connection. They are not connected to each other but leave a small gap in between. Okay, this small gap is called as the synapse or the synaptic cleft. Okay, synapse or the synaptic cleft. Okay, so we can see that the axon terminals of one neuron is not in close, means they are not connected to each other with the dendrites of the adjacent neuron, but they remain close together but leaves a small gap in between, and this gap is called as the synapse or the synaptic cleft. What is synapse can be asked for definition. What is synapse? Synapse is the point of contact between the terminal endings of the axon of one neuron and the dendrites of another neuron by a small gap. Okay, so remember the axon terminals of one neuron and the dendrites of the adjacent neuron are not in contact with each other but leaves a small gap in between, and this gap is called as the synapse or the synaptic cleft. Okay, can be either asked for definition or name the following, etc. And we have already seen that the axon terminals have small knobs, and these knobs or the bulbs have the chemical substances called neurotransmitter. An example of a neurotransmitter is acetylcholine, which is released into this synapse. As the impulse reaches the axon terminal, the acetylcholine will be released into the synapse or the synaptic cleft, and there will be certain reactions taking place there, and the impulse will jump into the dendrite of the adjacent neuron. That is how the impulse passes on from one neuron to another. You just understand that by the time the impulse reaches the axon endings or the axon terminals, the neurotransmitter, which is acetylcholine, will be released into the synaptic cleft or the synapse, and the impulse is able to jump from the axon ending of one neuron to the dendrite of the adjacent neuron. That is how a nerve impulse is transmitted from one neuron to the adjacent neuron. Moving on to the different types of neurons, there are three types of neurons. The first one is the sensory neuron, second is the association neuron, and the third is the motor neuron. As the name indicates, the first is the sensory neuron. What is a sensory neuron? Sensory neurons carry impulses from the sense organs, which are the receptors, to the main nervous system, that is the brain or the spinal cord. Okay, sensory neurons carry impulses from the sensory organs. Sensory organs are the receptors which receive the stimulus, and these neurons which carry the impulses from the sensory organs or sensory receptors to the nervous system, main nervous system, is called as the sensory neuron. Now moving on to the third type of neuron, we shall come to the second one later. The third type of neuron is the motor neuron. As the term indicates, it is a neuron which carry impulses from the brain or the spinal cord to the muscles or the glands, which are the effector organs. In the case of walking, I need to move from here to my table to take the book. So the impulse has to move from the brain to my to the muscles of my leg for me to move from here to the table to take the book from the table. I have to move my hand. So here the impulse is moving from the brain or the spinal cord to the muscles of my legs and hands, isn't it? So the effector organs may be glands, as in the case of the endocrine system. When the insulin level in blood, glucose level increases, immediately the message or the impulse will be sent to the brain that glucose is increasing, glucose level is increasing, it is dangerous, we have to bring the glucose level down. So immediately impulse will be passed on from the brain to pancreas, which is the endocrine gland which is responsible for the secretion of insulin. So the muscles and the glands are effectors or effector organs. Okay, so motor neurons are neurons that carry impulses from the main nervous system, that is the brain or the spinal cord, to the muscles or the glands. Now moving on to the second type of neuron, that is the association neuron. Association neuron, as the term indicates, it serves as a link or a connection between the sensory neuron and the motor neuron. So it is also called as the connecting neuron. Association neuron is also called as connecting neuron. It connects the sensory neuron with the motor neuron. So these are the three types of neurons. Now we shall see what is a nerve. Okay, a nerve is a bundle of nerve fibers. Nerve fibers refer to the axons of different neurons. A bundle of nerve fibers or axons of separate neurons, which is enclosed within a tubular sheath. So each of these you can see is the axon of 4 different neurons. Okay, the 4 different colors that you see here, just imagine these as the axons or we can say the nerve fibers of 4 different neurons. Okay, and what is a nerve? What is a nerve? A bundle of nerve fibers. This is a bundle of nerve fibers or axons enclosed within a tubular sheath. You can see a tubular sheath surrounding the neurons, surrounding the axons of the neurons. So that is a nerve. Each one is a neuron, and this entire thing with the different nerve fibers or axons enclosed within the tubular sheath, the entire thing is called as the nerve. Okay, so these nerves are again of 3 types. Okay, so definition of nerve, you should know what is a nerve. Nerve refers to a bundle of nerve fibers or axons of separate neurons enclosed within a tubular sheath. And as we have seen, there are three types of neurons. Similarly, there are three types of nerves also. The first type is the sensory nerve. Sensory nerves are formed of sensory neurons. Sensory nerves carry impulses from the sensory receptors to the brain or the spinal cord. The third type is the motor neuron. As we have seen, motor nerve. Motor nerve is composed of motor neurons, and the function of motor nerve is to carry impulses from the brain or the spinal cord to the effectors, which may be muscles or glands. And the third type of nerve is the mixed nerve. Mixed nerves contain both sensory and motor nerves. Mixed nerve contain both sensory and motor nerves. An example of a mixed nerve is a spinal nerve. Can be asked for, name the following. Spinal nerve is an example of a mixed nerve. Spinal nerve contain both sensory and motor nerves. So as we have seen, there are three types of nerves: the sensory nerves, motor nerves, and mixed nerves. So I hope this session is clear to you. In this session, we have studied the structure of the neuron. We have seen what are the different types of neurons. We have seen how the impulse passes on from one neuron to the adjacent neuron. We have also discussed about what are nerves and the different types of nerves. So I hope, dear children, this session is clear to you. If you have any doubts regarding what we have studied today, please ask your doubts and give your suggestions in the comment section. Thank you.